mother sent me to Marseille to him so I could go to school.
Now this was what, October, November?
No,
42?
this was later than that because I had been in Grolais several months.
So
I will say maybe 6 months.
So
Yeah.
spring of 1943, maybe.
Yeah. So he had a hotel room and he had a job, not very good job, but in a butcher shop. But anyway, she thought that would be best for me. Well, come to find out, the concierge, which is the keeper of the building of the hotel, would not let me stay with him because that was rented for one person, and she just wouldn't let me stay with him. So what I did, I went to school every day, and every night I would do my homework on a bench on the boulevard, and we would wait till she turned her light out and go to bed, and then he would smuggle me into his bedroom. Sometimes we were lucky it was 10 o'clock, sometimes it was 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's how I spent my time with him for a while, but it was not possible. I mean, I couldn't live like that. I just would drag myself to school. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 hours sleep, very little food. So,
and Marseille was in Free France?
Marseille was in Free France, yes. So my mother heard that on the 16th, the Red Cross was sending children to the United States. They were able to get the Jewish children under 16 to be sent to the United States from Free France. So she asked me to come back, and she was going to send me to the United States. Well, of course, I would never think of leaving her. I started crying, and I said, wherever she goes, I'll go. She said, you remember what your father said? But that did not count. So I refused to go to the United States. So I stayed with my mother a little bit in Grolais. In the meantime, our Belgian, the Germans picked up all the Belgian Jews that had fled Belgium. There were about 6 families. So our Belgian cousins were picked up to be deported to concentration camp.
Did you see them again?
No. That was 3 brothers who were about my mother's age, their wives. One had a son and a daughter, and one had 2 sons who, when the Germans came, those 2 sons were not home. They came in the morning early, and they didn't take my mother or me. They were just looking for Belgian Jews. I guess they had a system, And the two sons were not home. One was 18 and one was 19. One was spending the night with the son of the French family, non-Jewish family that was employing them, those leather goods. And one had gone out, he had a little garden in the fields. We knew where they were. So, of course, the Germans didn't say, that they were taking these people to a concentration camp. They were sending them to interrogate them about Belgium. But we knew, of course. So
How did you know?
Well, because we had already fled, Paris, and then my father had told us all this, and then we had gotten all these letters from Poland. I mean, we really didn't know they were burning Jews. No, still didn't know they were actually burning Jews in concentration camps, but we knew they were doing away with them, they were mistreating them, working them to death. I mean, that much, we knew. So my sister went to the field. I forgot to tell you, my sister had come back from Paris because with her work, she could not support herself. She just did not make enough money, to pay for everything. And so she had written, and she said that she just, my mother even had to send her food that we didn't even have, once in a while. So she says, maybe I could come back and hide there, And so my sister had just come back, because we had this meeting with this man. He was going to help us anyway, she says, and maybe we'll do whatever he decides to do that we should do, we'll do it together. So she happened to have just been back, and so she fled to the field and told one of the 2 brothers what had happened. Well, he started crying, he wanted to come back home and go with his parents, and she wouldn't let him. She pushed him into an outdoor house, where they have, and she says, I'm not going to let you go, I'm not going to let you go, it's just, being killed. And the other boy, the people that he was spending the night with, hid him. And then after a few days went by, my sister finally, he quieted down, and he stayed in that outhouse, and we would take him food every day. And for a few days, you know, and after things looked sort of quiet, the French people who were hiding the other boy took the two boys and sent them off to Savoie. It's in the Alps, and to the French underground. And they survived. They stayed in the French underground till the war was over, and they survived.
What happened to you and your sister and your mother?
All right, so
after
this
that?
man, Mr. Lotard, called a meeting, and this was the period, this period here. And this is me at 15, my sister. That's Mr. Lotard's daughter. And she was going with him, Maurice, he was a Jewish boy, and hiding in that little village from Paris. These two, Henri and Suzanne, were also Jewish children. She was my age, he was maybe 16. They were deported.
And this picture was taken in 1943.
This picture was taken in 1943. I didn't get it till last year. This Maurice married her, and I hadn't seen him for 14 some odd years, and we had a reunion last year when I was in Paris. He told me about the picture, and he had one made for me, one for my sister. So I just got it in May. Actually, not last year, this year in May. So he called us, and he said, he says, go into the townhouse, get the official stamp out, and he says, I'm going to buy ID cards, blank ID cards, and this is also the period of the, excuse me, this is my false identification card, and this is a blank ID card. You buy it like that, then you put your picture on there, and he says, I'm going to get a list from people who exist, and each one should correspond pretty much to your age. He says, looks, he says, I don't know, because he didn't know those people. He says, but age-wise, they have to be, I wasn't 15 at the time, but they have to be 15 to have an ID card. So he says, I have to have someone that's at least 15. And he says, then he says, you all have to leave and go back into occupied France. He says, Free France now is more dangerous than occupied France, because all the Jews that were not taken in Free France were now sitting ducks in Free France. So he says, now, as Gentiles, and you go back, he says, to occupied France, he says, you will be much safer. Well, this uncle who was in Marseille had met a Jewish girl also there, hiding, and from Paris, and they had become engaged, and they had the same problem. They were like sitting ducks in Marseille. So her family was hiding in outside of a little hamlet, also not far from Le Mans. And she said to him, you know, she says, they're hiding there as non-Jews, and she says, the peasants are very good and don't know anything about Jews, and her father was a shoemaker. She says, why don't we try to get false identification papers and go hide over there? So he was already there in this little town called Saint-Frambeau. It wasn't a town, it was a hamlet. It only had 35 houses. And so he was already there with his girlfriend and her family, and he is the one who said, well, come and join me. I'm over there as a, saying that I'm a butcher by trade, and I fled Paris because the Germans wanted to send me to Germany for hard labor. I didn't want to do that, you know, and of course the people were more or less anti-German, you know, and they were very good to him. So he says, why don't you explain to Monsieur Lotard that my mother could not get a false ID as a French native because she had an accent. So to make her a card as a Polish-born Christian, and you are her two nieces, you don't have any family, you don't have any mother or father, that your mother or father were killed in the bombing outside of Paris. Paris was not bombed, but the outskirts were. And he said that we will tell them that story, that you were bombed, you have no house, so I'm bringing you over here, you know, and to sit it out till, because everybody was sure, you know, that the Germans would lose the war. I mean, that's what, you know, kept us. I mean, we just knew that they couldn't possibly win the war. So
when you say you knew they couldn't possibly win the war, was that just optimism in the face of what you were going through, or
yes.
were you getting any information?
Not really. Not really. We did try to listen to the radio from Radio England, you know, for what they call free English, but it had become so dangerous to listen to that radio, because there were always people denouncing people. I mean, you know, maybe not a whole lot, but even a small percentage. So we really, and the newspapers were all censored. No, it was just optimism. That's what kept us. I mean, they couldn't possibly win, you know. I mean, that's what kept us going. So we joined him. So Mr. Lothar made us cards like that, false identification cards, and then we took the train and went back into occupied France, and my uncle came to pick us up like a real peasant. He wore wooden shoes and with straw in his shoes, you know, and the beret, and just a real French peasant. And then he introduced us. He was renting a room at these peasants' house. He was a wooden shoemaker, and she was actually a hired hand. She went from farm to farm and put in a day's work, and then came back home. So he rented. The house was not much. It was big, but it was like the ground floor had no floor. It was earth floors, and but he had lots of room. So he rented us a room too. My uncle had a room there, and we had a room there, and we told him we got bombed, you know, and he believed everything we said. To earn money for our keeps, my uncle would butcher cattle, because see what happened. The Germans had they came and counted the cattle heads in each farm, and that was requisitioned. They came and when that cattle was raised to where it could be eaten, they came and got that cattle. So if the peasants wanted any for themselves, if they had to, like for instance, a little cow was born, you know, they would not tell them that the little cow was born. So that's what they would do to have meat for themselves. And my uncle would butcher the little calf, and then for payment they would give him meat. They didn't have any money really, and they were, you know, just little peasants. And my mother would go every day from farm to farm and do mending, you know, well, really nothing but mending from old clothes, you know, on old clothes. And my sister and I would spin the yarn and knit, make socks and sweaters. We were very good at that, and they would pay us with food. And since the people who were sheltering us were not, all he did was he would have a vineyard and make his own wine for himself, but he did not have any farmland, so we would share the food, which at the time we had plenty of, with them, and that would pay for our room. But however, we had to eat at the same table, because there was just one tremendous big kitchen and one table, you know. So we were there several months. It was, and yes, we were there several months, because Normandy, D-Day had already, now there we could listen to the English radio, because we were so isolated. As I say, it was just a hamlet with 35 people. And there was a little chapel in the middle of the little square that was 1,300 years old. And it wasn't used. It was just sitting there, you know. And so we knew, you know, that the Americans had landed. And of course, it was just a matter of waiting.
So you were there almost a year.
Well,
because Because
all together, almost a year. So yeah, we were there close to a year, I guess. When this,
so it's June 1944 when D-Day, wasn't that D-Day? It was June 1944.
Yeah, I think so.
And then you stayed there in that village, in that hamlet, a little longer.
We stayed. Well, we were there, I'd say, when this incident happened. Okay, they had already landed, but it took them several months before they came that deep, because we weren't far from Paris, actually. See, so we were sitting at the table eating, all of us, and he was the man. His name was Monsieur Artaud. Was for a peasant, because a lot of the French peasants have very little education. He was not. He was fairly well educated, because he had studied to be a priest one time in his life, and he didn't finish. But he was well learned. Now she wasn't. She couldn't read and write. So he was reading the paper. He was my mother's age, so he was right around 40, I guess, 41. And all at once he says, he says, that's every day in the paper, it was Jews, Jews, Jews. He would say, because they were censored papers, of course, he said, he says, if one of them, he says, comes on my property, he says, I will get my, what do you call that prong that you pick up?
Pitchfork.
Pitchfork. I will take my pitchfork, he says, and he says, I'll get him right against the wall, he says, and I'll hold him there. And he says, and he keeps on rattling. Well, my uncle thought it was funny. My uncle back then was like, 32 years old. He was a bachelor. But of course, and we did too. But my mother, of course, didn't think it was so funny. So my uncle says to him, well, how would you know? He said, if it was a Jew. He says, I wouldn't know. He says, they have ears like this and noses like this. And he says, they look like this. Anyway, he was describing them. He said, well, did you ever see one? He said, I don't have to see. He didn't know anything except what he saw in the papers. He said, I don't have to see one. I know. So that night, of course, we talked among ourselves, and my mother said, she says, I hope he never finds out. She says, you know what's waiting if he does find out. And, that went on. Well, shortly after that is when a D-Day had already happened. So maybe I'm saying maybe a couple or 3 months after that, because we stayed there a whole year all together. My sister and I, there was no running water there, and there was no bathroom. I mean, bathroom was outside. So we would take a little bowl of water and go brush our teeth on the stairs of the little chapel. That's how we cleaned up in the morning in pretty weather. So we were brushing our teeth, and this man came by on a bike, a Parisian, looking for food. They did that a lot, came in the country. And we came face to face with him, and he was a neighbor of ours in Paris, and he was a well-known collaborator with the Germans. And of course it was, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Well, of course he knew what we were doing. He knew we were Jewish. And he turned right around, got on his bike, and left. So we came in the house and told my mother. She says, that's it. She says, he is going to the nearest commandanture and to denounce us. And they were getting I don't remember, a good bit of money for each Jew that was denounced. So we called my uncle, and we told him, and we said, that's it, what are we going to do? When he finds out, Monsieur Artaud, you know how he feels about Jews. And my uncle said, no, he says, we have to tell him the truth. He says, he loves us. He did like us a lot, especially my uncle. He says he doesn't know what a Jew is. He says, where are we going to go? He says, either he turns us in or he hides us. So he calls him and he says, Monsieur Artaud, he says, I told you so and so and so. He said, well, all that is a lie. He says, we are Jews. He told him he says, you're not. He says, yes, we are. And he says, you're not. He says, look, he says, now we don't have much time. He says, I'm going to tell you what happened. He tells him that we were discovered here. And he says, and what are we to do? So the man fell to his knees, and he started crying like a baby. And my uncle couldn't quiet him, and he thought maybe he was afraid. He says, look, he says, you have to get yourself together. He says, if you want us to leave, we'll leave. He says, no, no, no. He says, forgive me, forgive me. He says, I am so mortified. He was so mortified because of what he had said at the table. And he felt so bad that he had said that about the Jews. And this is why he was crying like that, like a baby. So anyway, he said, he was quite smart. He says, look, he says, they only saw the girls. They didn't see the mother. He says, he says, do they know you, my uncle? Does he know you? He says, no, he doesn't know me. He says, all right. He says, we have to think fast. He says, if he went to the closest commandant or gendarmerie, he will be back here in about 2 hours. He says, we have to hide. So he says, I will go, where he had, he made his own wine, and he had like a little colline, which is like a little elevation, and he had made a cellar under there, you know. So he went in there and emptied 3 barrels that were full of wine, put each one of us in a barrel, my mother in one, my sister in one, me in another. And he told my uncle, and you and I sit down, and we ignore the whole thing, he says, and have a drink. And that's exactly what happened. They came in, but it was not the German, it was the French gendarmes came back. And they said, where are the girls? So Monsieur Arthur said, what girls? So the first thing of course I didn't see that, you know, because we were hiding, but he told us. The first thing they did is just hit him over the head with the back of their gun, you know. And then asked my uncle, where are the girls? Of course, you know, they beat them up. And then Monsieur Arthur said he saw that, you know, they were going to really, who knows? So he said, oh, he said, the girls, he says, that's right. He said, a couple of hours ago, he says, a couple of Parisian girls came by, and he said they were looking for food. You know how these Parisians come looking for food. And he says, I don't have any, you know, I'm not a farmer. He said that they stopped and they brushed their teeth. In fact, he says, I ran them off. He says, because they were brushing their teeth, he says, on the steps of the chapel. He says, and I thought that was not nice, you know. And he says, and they left. He says, I don't know where they went. So I don't know he says that if the Americans hadn't already landed in Normandy, that God knows what they would have done to him. But they were afraid, you know, to do any more harm. So they left, and then waited till dark, and then he came in and brought us some water. And, you know, we stayed in there for, almost 5 days in those barrels. Because they were afraid that, you know, we were watched. And we made it.
And what happened after that?
Well, after that, shortly after that, the first 2 Americans came in a Jeep. And they were lost, actually, because they never came to that hamlet. They landed, well, they came as far as Le Mans, because this place is really unbelievable. It's 40 kilometers from a train station, you know. It has no mayor. The mayor is 7 kilometers closest town. But 2 Americans were lost and came in a Jeep. And our cat was having kittens, and we named the first kitten Yankee. And they stopped, you know, and they said, you know, we landed in Le Mans. I mean, we're already in Le Mans. And they said, you're liberated, you know, and then we, well, yes and no. I mean, the Germans were still there, but they had been defeated. So in fact, they were pretty mean at the time. They did some horrible things. While they were defeated, we saw them march, you know, coming through, and the Americans were after them. In fact, they burned a town called, at that time, they passed a little town called Oradour-sur-Glane. It's become a national shrine. And they were defeated. I mean, the Americans were after them, and that was unbelievable that they did such a thing. They rounded up everybody in that little village, locked them up in the church, and put the church afire and burned everybody alive in there. They did some pretty horrible things. But you'll be surprised. So anyway, we were liberated, and we had my uncle always told them that they had a son and a daughter, these people, also farm hands. And the son was very gifted drawing, and I was very gifted too. We used to draw together on his day off. So my uncle always said, well, if I survive this and I go back to Paris and I'm lucky enough to open my butcher shop again and make a living, he said, I will make it up to all of you. We will make it up. And we did. Because, we were liberated. We came back to Paris. We had no place to live. The little our apartment where we lived before, I have to tell you this, there was a little business downstairs. It was a lady who'd never been married and her father. And they had a little apartment attached to the business. Well, they always liked our little apartment on the second floor. So the lady took that apartment and would not give it back to us, you know. And there was no place, you couldn't find a place to live in Paris. We didn't have much money anyway, if any. But so we had no place to live.
When you came back to Paris, did you see people, those people that you saw that you knew, were they surprised you were still alive? I mean, did they?
Well, we really didn't see anybody to begin with. I mean, oh, you mean the people where we lived? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were surprised. They were. But the janitor, the concierge, she said she thought we would always come back. She had, where my parents lived, the Germans, I forgot to tell you too. Okay, the concierge hid my mother and my sister for 5 days because we had a policeman that lived above us, and then we had a policeman that lived on the 5th floor. The policeman that lived above us was a collaborator. The one that lived on the 5th floor was not. So the one that lived on the 5th floor had come down to the concierge and told her, there were 3 Jewish families in that building, and told her, you know, he says, tomorrow we have orders to go with the Germans and pick up every Jew in the city. He said, we have a list, every woman, child, man. He says, if you can, he says, go to these 3 families and hide them, because their places at 5 o'clock tomorrow, there will be a knock on their door. So the concierge hid those, I was in France, I was hid those 3 families. And of course my father was already taken, but she hid my mother and my sister, and she hid a family was 3 daughters, and another family was a son and a daughter. She had, on the same floor where my parents lived, right across the hall, there's 2 apartments on each floor, there was a Gentile family whose husband was a prisoner of war, and she went back with her little girl to live with her mother, and she left the keys with the concierge, and the concierge hid them all in that apartment. So when the Germans came and knocked on the doors that morning and there was no answer, they pushed the doors in, and they were so angry to find, because my mother, she says you could hear everything. It was on the same floor. She says they were so angry they threw all the furniture out the window, and they even ripped the electric wires out of anger because they didn't find anybody.
So when you went back after the liberation, and you finally found a place to live in the same neighborhood?
No, what happened, all right, so we had no place to live. My uncle had gone back a little ahead of us. He said he wanted to see if he could make a living. Well, sure enough, his butcher shop had been closed, and it had a big sign on there, went off to war. And it just stayed like that all these years. Because, see, if you were a prisoner of war, if you went off to war, they just left the businesses, till you came back. I mean, they did not investigate whether he was Jewish or not. He went back to war. He went off to war. So all he had to do is open that butcher shop and walk in. And he just made a real good living immediately, because there was just, it was such a demand for all kinds of food. I mean, he would go, you know, slaughter his own cattle, you know, outside of Paris and bring it back. But he couldn't find, so he found a little hotel room close to the butcher shop, and he could not find us a place. So finally he told the lady who owned the hotel, which was a terrible hotel, it was like a fifth-class hotel, and I hate to tell you, where all the pimps and the prostitutes live, but that was the kind of a, you know, dirty hotel. I mean, but, you know, and he told her, well, if you give me a room, if you let me rent a room for my sister and her two daughters, I will give you meat, you know, and I'll do this, I'll do that.
Okay.
So anyway, she found us a room on the 6th floor for the three of us, and it was this bribery, and there was no running water. To go to the toilet, forget the shower, the bathroom, but go to the toilet. You had to go on the main floor, you know, where 6 people shared it, and it was just a real. We all slept in one double bed, and it was not much bigger than my bathroom, the whole thing. And it was the walls. It was very, very old hotel were full of bed bugs. So the first night we spent there, we stayed 1 whole year in that hotel room. The first night we spent there, the bed bugs came out the walls. That's a horrible experience. So we decided to leave the lights on. Well, for a few nights they didn't come out, but then they got used to the lights, so they started coming out. So what we would do is one night out of 3, one would stay and watch and smack the bed bugs with a newspaper while 2 slept. So those were very hard years because we had no money. I went back to school. My sister went to work. My mother found a job in a sweatshop doing, like I said, she could sew well, doing, you know, finishing work. But it was, for some reason we thought, oh, the war was going to be over and everything would be, you know, just fine. My father would come back. Well, so we always lived for that. And then all at once, there was, you know, it wasn't like that at all. And also, I want to tell you, when the Germans invaded France, my father, by that time, you know, had a pretty nice job, and he had saved up some money, and he had enough to buy $600 from with his French francs, buy $600 because it was the rumor or whatever said, you know, your French franc will be worth nothing. You know, people who have a little money should buy some dollars. That may save your life later on, whatever. So he had bought $600. And but we were not allowed to have that money, that 600, that in dollars. So he told my mother. He says, you know, in the dining room in the apartment, he opened the what do you call that strip of wood that runs
The shoe molding.
The shoe molding, but it over there, you know, it's pretty high shoe molding, like in the old apartments. So he said he opened that up and he hid the $600, and he said, "You never know, you know, this we are not going to touch. It may save your life anyway." So he hid that $600, and when all this came and he was taken, and my mother had to hide and all that, she forgot to take that $600 out. And when she came back when we came back after the war, she she went to see the lady who was occupying the apartment. She says, "Would you please let us move back?" She says, "You do have an apartment downstairs. We live in this horrible hotel room." And she refused. But she looked at the apartment, and the lady had done quite a bit of remodeling, and it looked like to my mother like that shoe molding was not the same, you know. It looked like, because there was a lot of wood half way up the wall, and that was gone, see? So she knew that the money was gone too. And so she said, forget it. But when we finally, after a year, moved into the apartment, and that's the first thing she did, that money was still there. But we lived in that hotel, like I said, for a whole year, and we had some tragic, hilarious, unusual experiences, because here we were, you know, three very nice women living among people, like, you know, almost like dans Les Miserables. It was practically the same thing. And I'd like to tell you at least about one experience in that hotel, which was really hilarious. So I went back to school. My sister went to work. My mother did too. And my mother noticed that every time she went to draw water on, you know, the main floor, this Arab was always coming to draw water too. And she says, so she told her, she says, you know, she says, I think that this Arab maybe likes you girls or whatever. She said, we were afraid, you know. She says, be very careful when you walk in and come to the room, put the chain, you know, had a chain, a safety chain. She says, because she says, and if he's out there, don't hang around the water, even if you can't get in water. So sure enough, we noticed he was always there. And one day, my mother said there was a knock on the door, and she opened the door with the chain on. There was this Arab standing in the doorway with his wax mustache, you know, and his slick black hair, with a bouquet of flowers in his hand. And she said, my daughter's not here. He says, I didn't come to see your daughter. She said, well, she said, my big daughter's not here. She said, well, my little daughter's not here either. He said, well, I didn't come to see your little daughter. She said, well, what do you want? He said, well, I want you. So anyway, she became very afraid. And she says, whatever, you know, she closed the door. And she says, go away and all that. And then that evening she told my uncle, she says, you know, this Arab, you know, came and it was flowers. I'm so afraid and all that. So he says to her, well, he says, you let me handle it. I was in the French Foreign Legion, you know, and he says, and I know how to handle these people. He says, because if he starts with you ladies, you know, he's not going to leave you alone. He may think you're one of these ladies of the night, he says, so I have to set him straight. So he disappeared. He was gone a good while. He came back. He was white as a sheet. He says, let me sit down and give me a stiff drink. He says, I went and talked to him, he says, but he says, let me tell you, he says, I thought I knew how to handle them. And he says, I went to him and I said, look, he says, you know, he says, those three women, that's my sister and my two nieces. And they're not, he says, prostitute. They are nice women. He said, well, he says, I know. That's why I came with flowers. I know they're nice women. He says, that's why I like them. So he says, but he says, you know, he says, they're not your kind of women. He says, nah. He says, I was in the French Foreign Legion, and I says, you're not supposed to bother women like that. He says, if I see you, he says, just look at him. He says, just look at him. He says, see, I have this knife that long, which he didn't have, of course, you know, with the one that you block, you know, he was telling, he says, I will open your stomach, he says, from here to here. Of course, you know, he says, he was shaking all inside, he says, because either he was going to be afraid of him or he was going to, you know, open the knife on him too. So anyway, that's how he got him to leave us alone totally.
Well, would you tell me about your experience later on when you applied for reparations?
All right. So I went to school for a little while, and times were just too hard, you know, because even all of us working, I mean, we had no furniture, we had nothing. So my sister found a job at Orly Field as a secretary, and then they needed a file clerk, and she found me a job as a file clerk, which I did not know how to do, but they taught me. I was pretty bright, I must say, and she had taught me English too in our hiding years, so my English was not too bad, because she could speak English. She had gone to England a couple of times, and so we all went to work, and then we got our apartment back, and then I met my husband at Orly Field. He was an American station. Those days it was the Air Force of the Army. They didn't have an Air Force, and we went together for about 3.5 years, and he brought me back to the States, and I got married. And then it came out, my mother started many years later. I was already here, maybe 10 or 12 years, I don't remember, a long time. And she says that the French government had received a lump sum of money from the German government to give to all the French Jews that had lost their whatever, you know, some people had only lost furniture, some people had lost a business and all that, and they give it to the French people. And the German government would also, is also ready to pay reparations, but not automatically, that you had to apply for it. But she wanted me to apply for it. Well, I wouldn't, because it involved, you know, a lot of paperwork, a lot of research, a lot of whatever, and I just didn't want to be bothered. So she did it for me in France, and she applied for reparations, you know, for herself and my sister and me, but I didn't get it through this country. I got it in France, and so what happened is they agreed, you know, to pay a widow's pension to my mother for killing my father, and they agreed to pay no big pension, but a small pension that goes up a few percent every year for cost of living to my sister and I for all the mental anguish that we had to suffer because of them, and physical too, really, you know. And then as years went by, my mother was called by the French police, and she was shown a letter to where my father was denounced. Actually, when my father was taken, he was not taken because he was Jewish. He was denounced because he was in the French underground listening to the English radio. And the man who denounced him lived in the same building on the 6th floor. He was a collaborator. So they asked her if she wanted to press charges, and she said yes. And he got 15 years in jail. And she also received, oh yes, I want to tell you. So all these years that we lived in France, my father applied for French citizenship because my father served in the Polish army. He did not flee, you know, not to serve. So he had his Polish citizenship. And when, after a few years, I don't know how long exactly, he was called for an interview to become a French citizen, but they refused him because he didn't have any sons. They told him plain he didn't have any sons, so they wouldn't give him the citizenship. But after the war, since my father died for France, then they wanted to give the citizenship to my mother.
Do you have a document in reference to your reparations?
Oh, yes. So after many years, like I said, this is the document where I was accepted, you know, to receive reparations. I don't even remember what year, but it's on there. Well, is it? I don't remember. 1963, and every month I get a pension from them. And my mother, until she died last year, she was 3 weeks short of being 88 years old. She received, then the French government also gave her a pension, because not only did they give her French citizenship after the war, many years after the war, but also a pension because my father died for France. So actually, thank God, she was in her old age, she was comfortable enough with 2 pensions and socialized medicine and all that. So, and she remained in Paris, and I still have, my sister lives in Paris and her family. So.
Well, would there be anything else you would like to
Well,
add?
yes, I would like to say that we often talk about in later years in anti-Semitism in France. Of course, there is anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism all over the world. But look at us. And other members of our family. My father had a brother and his 3 children and wife that survived also in Paris because they were saved by French non-Jews. They stuck their neck out for us. They didn't make any money. I mean, it was not just their neck, I mean their house, their wives, their families. So whole villages, you know, have hidden Jews. And we always seem to speak only about the anti-Semitism, and we don't really speak much about the ones that have saved all the Jews.
You said that your brother had promised to make it up to that family.
Oh, my uncle.
I'm sorry,
My
your uncle, right. And how did that...
He did.
If
We
you could
did.
tell me briefly how that took place.
All right. Well, after the war, then he opened up his butcher shop. First, he told the man and wife, the parents, that he would bring them to Paris. They had never been on a train and never been in a car. I mean, just a horse was their only transportation. And he would take them all over Paris and just show them the biggest time. So he brought them to Paris, and they arrived. In fact, the suit and the dress that they got married in, they had put away to be buried in. And they dug that out to come to Paris. And so it was absolutely fabulous. He took them to all the nightclubs and the Folies Bergère, and they just did not know that such a thing existed. But that was not the most important. He brought the daughter, who was around my age, maybe a year or so older, into his house because he got married and had 2 children later on. And she stayed and she helped him a little bit in the house, but she was really like a child in the house. And she met a very nice young man, quite a wealthy young man, an engineer, got married, and of course she could never have done that well. And we brought the son, and he went on to school after we got our little apartment back. It was not a big apartment, but my mother made a little room for him. And he went on to school, became a draftsman, and became a draftsman and got a very good job with Renault. And he just retired. And he went back, the parents are dead, but he went back to the village. In fact, I just heard from him. And I'm going to, well, I've been back to the village, but I'm going to go see him and his wife when I go back. And he's done very well, of course. And he never could have done that if it hadn't been for us, you know. So at least we were able to pay them back, at least. And they were wonderful people. My mother, at the time, every year when they made the wine from the grapes, she went back every year. And she would be there because it's a very happy time of the year when they make the wine, and always stay a whole week. And the first time I went back, the very first time, is when my boys and I went back on a vacation. One was 5 and one was 8. And I went back. It was my mother. And so Monsieur Artaud and his wife told the whole neighborhood, and the mayor of the next town, because the mayor, when we told him we were Jewish, also knew we were Jewish. See, it had become a family affair. See, everybody knew we were Jewish, and everybody was supposed to say they didn't know anything about us. See, so the mayor came, and they killed, I don't know how many ducks and how many chickens and how many rabbits, and we had a feast like of 50 people, you know, and we stayed there several days with my sons. It was lovely, lovely. But like coming back to anti-Semitism, I want to stress that there is anti-Semitism no more than anywhere else in this world, you know, and I would like to say that, you know, there are plenty of good French people who are not anti-Semitic to this date.
Well, thank you very, very much.